Every body tells its own story, some louder than others. And then there are cases that don't just speak to you, they linger. The man had arrived mid-morning, mid-50s, natural causes, cardiac arrest. There was nothing particularly unusual about the paperwork. He'd been found at home by his daughter, no signs of trauma. Medical history showed a mix of hypertension and long-standing diabetes, but nothing out of the ordinary in our world. When people pass, especially in their sleep like this man had, the process is usually straightforward. He was brought in about 18 hours after death. And rigor had already come and gone. That window matters to us. Once rigor passes, the body becomes pliable again. Easier to pose, easier to care for. I did my usual assessment. Checked the limbs, the jaw, the tissue condition. Everything was soft, responsive, cool as expected. There was nothing that stood out. He had a bit of a heaviness to him, not just in weight, but in presence. Sometimes it's hard to explain. There was something still about him, not disturbed, not tense, just full, like he hadn't quite finished something. His family had chosen a full viewing, so the preparation needed to be clean and careful. As always, I started with the features, setting the mouth, securing the eyelids, cleansing the skin. He had a faint crease between his brows that didn't want to relax, even after massaging. It gave him this expression, like he was still concentrating on something. Most people, you can soften that tension. With him it stayed. I moved on to the arterial injection. Right carotid, as usual. Raised the vessel carefully, secured the cannula, and began the pump. The pressure was set to a moderate level, nothing too high, to avoid distension. As the fluid started to circulate, I gently guided the left arm to ensure even distribution. Everything was going as expected. Then, he sat up. No warning, no muscle tremor, no spasm or arch. He simply rose, halfway up from the table, torso at about a 45-degree angle, arms still at his sides, eyes open. I didn't move for a few seconds. The pump kept humming. The fluid line didn't jolt or snap. His eyes, they weren't wide or startled. They were just open, fixed on nothing. His head tilted slightly to the left, and then he stopped moving. It wasn't a twitch. It wasn't post-mortem contraction. Those things are quick, reactive. What I saw was controlled, balanced, intentional looking, even though I knew it couldn't be. Rigor mortis had long passed. His muscles should have been relaxed, not lifting the weight of his own torso. I turned off the pump and lowered the table's incline gently. His body didn't resist. It came back down as if nothing had happened. I checked his limbs again, still soft. No signs of fresh rigor. His face returned to its original expression, that same faint crease in his brow. There was no heartbeat, no breath, no signs of life, just the strange echo of what had just happened. I stood there for a long time, gloved hands resting on the edge of the table, just watching him. I wasn't afraid. There was no sense of threat. If anything, there was an overwhelming feeling of presence, not supernatural, human, heavy. Later, when reviewing the files again, something caught my eye. His daughter had written a personal note on the intake form, just a few lines. Dad always said he wanted to go out on his own terms. He hated feeling out of control. If he ever died lying down, he used to joke he'd sit up just to prove he still could. It wasn't meant to be taken literally, just something people say. But somehow it stuck with me. I double-checked the body positioning system, looked for mechanical faults. Nothing. The table was level, no slope, no sudden tilt. There were no gases left in the abdomen that would have caused bloating or upward pressure. Not at that stage, not with the drainage line working as it was. No sudden rigor, no seizure-like behavior, nothing I could document or explain. The rest of the preparation went as planned. I finished the injection, dressed him in the navy blue suit his daughter had brought in, neatly folded, still smelling faintly of cedar from the closet. His eyes stayed closed the second time I set them. This time they held. During the viewing, I stayed close. It's habit, but this time it felt necessary. His daughter walked up to the casket, touched his hand, and whispered something I didn't hear. She didn't cry, just nodded, like she understood something the rest of us didn't. That night, I sat in the prep room a little longer than usual. Sometimes, silence is just part of the job. But that evening, the quiet felt like it had weight. What happened in that moment, when he sat up? I won't pretend to have a scientific explanation. Could have been some rare muscular reaction. Could have been a postural reflex that slipped through the cracks of my training. But if I'm honest, I don't think it was mechanical. I think, Maybe some people hold on tighter than others. Maybe he needed that one last act of defiance, one last gesture to remind us he had a say in it. And then he let go. I document everything in my reports. But that part, that moment, that stays with me. Not because it scared me, but because it reminded me how close the living and the dead still are, even when we think the line is clear. It rarely is. Serving in the death care industry for over 20 years, you see a lot in that time. Everything from the tragic to the downright bizarre. But I've always approached my work with the same mindset. Practical, steady, grounded. I'm not one to chase ghost stories. I respect the dead, and I believe they deserve our care, not our fear. That said, there's one case I still think about, more than I'd like to admit. Not because I was afraid, but because I couldn't explain what kept happening around her. It started on a rainy Thursday. I remember because I'd just finished an early case, a stroke victim in her 70s. And I was grabbing a late lunch in the lounge when the director called me back in. A new case had arrived from the coroner's office. A woman in her early 30s, cause of death, cardiac arrest, but the circumstances were flagged. Possible ritual involvement was noted in the paperwork, whatever that meant. Normally I'd roll my eyes at that sort of thing. We're in the business of death, not drama. Still, I took it seriously, because there were extra precautions listed. Family had requested limited contact, minimal cosmetics, no religious symbols of any kind. She came in covered with a heavy white sheet, still zipped in the transport bag. I unzipped it and immediately noticed the markings on her skin. Faint symbols, burned or branded in small organized patterns across her chest and upper arms. They didn't look like anything I'd seen in medical records before. Not surgical scars. Not decorative tattoos. These were raw and recent. The notes mentioned they'd happened during the ceremony she'd been participating in at the time of her death. No further explanation. No context. I remember just standing there for a minute, staring at her. Something about her expression. It wasn't peaceful, not like most people I work on. There was a tension in her jaw, in the way her hands were clenched, even in death, like she hadn't let go all the way. I got to work. I always start by cleaning the body thoroughly. But with her I had to go slow. The markings had begun to scab, and some were weeping slightly. That's not uncommon in trauma cases, but for some reason, touching them made me feel hesitant. Like I was brushing against something that wasn't fully resolved. Still I continued. The embalming itself was routine. No circulatory complications, no bloating, no tissue damage. Her system took the fluid well, but the whole time I had this odd feeling that I wasn't quite alone. Now listen. I don't mean that in a spooky way. It wasn't a cold breeze or a flickering light. Just this awareness, like someone was waiting behind me. I checked more than once, even turned the music off completely, thinking maybe it was a staff member who'd walked in without me hearing. But every time I looked, it was just me. I didn't say anything to the others. We're all professionals. You don't want to sound like you're losing it in the prep room. But the next day, the apprentice, Melissa, came to me and asked something strange. "Hey," she said. "Who was in the back room with you yesterday?" "No one," I replied. "Why?" She hesitated. "I was walking by the viewing window, and I could have sworn I saw someone behind you. Tall, just standing there." I looked at her carefully. She wasn't joking. She even got a little flushed, like she was embarrassed to be asking. I brushed it off with a shrug, said maybe it was the reflection of a card or something. But then it kept happening. A couple of the night shift staff, who only came into the prep area for cleaning or maintenance, started mentioning that they avoided walking past her station. One of them, Sam, a tough guy, been in janitorial work longer than I've been embalming, told me flat out, there's something wrong with her spot. Every time I turn my back I feel like I'm being watched. I still didn't want to make a big deal about it. There's a level of psychological stress that comes with this job, and we all process it in different ways. Sometimes our brains trick us, especially when we're alone with the dead. But then, I saw it too. It was about 4 days in. We hadn't moved her yet, because her family was in dispute about the arrangements. I was cleaning up tools in the prep room, her table still off to the side, covered respectfully. I turned toward the sink, and caught movement in the corner of my eye. Just a shape, like someone stepping to the side behind the cabinet. I turned around, no one there. I walked around the prep station, still no one, but the hair on my forearms stood up, not from fear, but because I felt something was definitely there, present, observing. I took a few breaths, checked everything again. and went home for the night. That evening I looked over her file again. There were sparse details, but I found something I hadn't noticed before. A note from the coroner, participant in unregulated ritual ceremony. Signs of psychological stress prior to death. Family refused autopsy. She hadn't just died unexpectedly. She'd been involved in something her family didn't want examined too closely. Something that maybe shouldn't have been happening at all. The day before the service, I finished the final preparations, minimal cosmetic work, per request. I closed her eyes, gently, and styled her hair the best I could. She looked settled, finally. Some of that tension in her hands had released during the rest. But before I zipped the cover, I said something I hadn't planned to. "I don't know what you went through," I said quietly. "But you're safe now, I promise. No one's going to hurt you here." The air felt still, not ominous, not warm, just still. After the funeral, her station was cleaned and reset like usual. No one else reported anything unusual after that. Whatever had lingered, whether it was trauma, energy, or just the weight of our imaginations, seemed to fade once she was buried. I don't have an explanation. I still don't believe in ghosts, the way some people do. But I believe that the body carries more than tissue. It holds memory, stress, fear, and sometimes when a person dies with something unresolved, that weight can stay behind a while. In our line of work, we don't chase answers. We offer dignity. We care, and we remember, even when we don't fully understand. That's all I know. That's all I can know. Embalming has taught me to expect the unexpected, mostly in a clinical way. Bodies don't always behave like textbooks say they should. Sometimes a body's condition can surprise you, but I try to keep my focus on what I can control. Respect, care, precision. There's no room for superstition in this work. Still, there was one case that stuck with me, because it reminded me how fragile and unpredictable death can be, especially when the life before it was so broken. It started with a call from the coroner's office. They'd found a man dead under a bridge downtown. Homeless, no identification, no medical history on file. The coroner suspected natural causes, but because he was unidentified, the body came to us for embalming and storage, pending family or a claim. That's pretty routine. These cases are sadly common in large cities. What wasn't routine was what happened. Once I began the embalming, the man looked to be in his mid-40s, with weathered skin and a thin frame that told a story of years on the streets. His clothes were worn and dirty, his hands marked with cuts and scars consistent with a rough life. But when I began to prepare him, I noticed something unusual. His face was sunken, but his eyes were closed tight, more than usual. I gently tried to open them to clean the eyelids, as standard. That's when it started. As I worked around his eyes, a faint wetness appeared. At first I thought it was residual moisture, maybe from the environment. But as I continued, the wetness became more obvious, and then, slowly, blood began to seep from his closed eyelids. I froze. I stepped back and wiped the area carefully with a sterile cloth. The bleeding stopped briefly, but then resumed, slow and steady. It was as if his body was pushing back, resisting the procedure. I've never seen anything like it. My first thought was a ruptured blood vessel, maybe from trauma before death. But I knew from the coroner's report that there were no signs of external injury on the face or head. The eyes weren't injured, either. Still, I took extra care. Gentle motions, minimal pressure. I called over my supervisor just to check if this was something unusual. He inspected but said, "Sometimes the body surprises us. It could be post-mortem hemorrhaging, or the way the vessels break down in certain conditions." Not very comforting, but it made sense. After all, decomposition doesn't follow rules. Still, the bleeding kept happening. Small amounts, but persistent. I switched to using absorbent pads, and changed them frequently. The rest of the embalming went on without other issues. Circulation of the embalming fluid was normal. Veins didn't collapse, and the blood drainage worked as it should. What struck me most, though, was the feeling of the whole process. The man's body seemed fragile in a way I hadn't encountered before. It wasn't just the bleeding. His skin was unusually thin, almost fragile. His veins were prominent and easy to puncture. He looked like he had lived on the edge of survival for years. I wondered about the life he had before death. How many nights did he spend cold and hungry? How many times was he ignored? That body had held more than just blood. It held stories of pain and endurance no one would hear. The bleeding from his eyes felt almost symbolic, like his body was still trying to tell something even after death. I thought about how we care for bodies like this one. not just as patients or cases, but as people who deserve dignity. The next day, I spoke briefly with the funeral director. He told me the man was finally identified, a name, distant family found through some social workers. They wanted a simple service, no fuss. I thought about what I'd seen during embalming. The bleeding hadn't stopped entirely until the end, but by the time of the viewing, his face looked peaceful. It wasn't a ghost story or a haunting. It was a reminder that even after death, bodies react, that life leaves its marks in strange ways, that death isn't always neat or predictable. In this job, you learn to keep your emotions in check, but sometimes, a case like this lingers, not because it scared me, but because it reminded me how important our work really is. We hold their last image with care, we give them back their dignity, and sometimes, even in the bleeding eyes of a man who lived unnoticed, there's a quiet call for respect. That man with no pulse who bled, I won't forget him. And I'll carry his story with me every time I begin another case, reminding me why I do this. To honor the lives behind these bodies, no matter how broken or hidden they were. Routine is a quiet comfort in this line of work. The prep room has its rhythm. Bodies come in, we give them our attention, and then they go on to wherever they need to go next. There's a dignity in the process. And when done right, it brings a kind of peace, not just to the family, but to those of us who care for the dead. This particular case came in early on a Monday. The decedent was a middle-aged man, mid-50s. His name was Edward, and he had passed from complications following a long illness, something degenerative. His paperwork was clean, straightforward. No red flags, no unusual requests. Aside from a few ceremonial items his sister wanted near him during the viewing. His sister came in the next morning. She carried a small box, carefully wrapped in old linen. Inside were a few personal items, an old wristwatch, a pressed flower, and a beeswax candle about 6 inches tall. She said Edward had kept it beside his bed for years, told me it was the only thing that brought him comfort on his worst nights. She asked if we could light it and place it beside him during the private viewing in our chapel room. Not the kind of thing we usually allow. Open flames and funeral homes don't mix well. But this was one of those situations where you look at someone's face, and you know this request isn't about sentiment. It's about something deeper. Something that helped hold their family together through a long drawn-out loss. So I agreed, with the condition that I'd stay close by, just in case. The viewing was small, just the sister and 1 or 2 close friends. She lit the candle herself and placed it at the edge of the table, just next to his folded hands. The room was quiet for nearly an hour. I stayed just outside, out of respect, but close enough to intervene if needed. When they finished, I went in to clean up and prepare the body for transport to the crematory scheduled for the following morning. That's when I noticed it. The candle was still burning. Strong, steady flame, no flicker, no wax runoff. Now beeswax burns slow, sure, but this thing looked untouched, like it had just been lit a minute ago. I thought maybe she swapped it for a fresh one during the visit. Easy to overlook. I snuffed it out with a small metal cap and went back to my routine. The next morning, I walked into the chapel room again before transporting Edward to the crematory. The candle had been relit. That didn't make sense. I hadn't authorized anyone else to be in the room overnight, and the doors were all locked, security logs untouched. No signs of tampering. I figured maybe a staff member relit it out of sentiment or confusion, so I asked around. No one touched it. Not even our director, who's typically meticulous about those details. Curiosity got the better of me. I tried extinguishing it again. This time I used a small basin of water, just gently tipped the candle into it. I expected it to go out instantly. It didn't. The flame bent, sputtered a little, then kept burning. Fully submerged, still lit. It didn't grow or spark or behave oddly, it just wouldn't go out. I set it aside and got back to preparing the body for transfer. Sometimes when things don't make sense, the best thing to do is focus on the work. The dead are owed our presence, not our distractions. By the time I reached the crematory, I'd wrapped the candle in foil and tucked it into the small keepsake box to return to the sister later. I didn't mention the flame, didn't want to make something of it, but as I placed Edward onto the conveyor, I glanced into the container again. That flame still burning. Same height, same steady glow. The operator Dave, someone I've worked with for years, saw it too. He leaned in, frowned, then stepped back. "Is that thing battery powered?" he asked. "No," I said. "Beeswax." He shook his head slowly. Weird. We let it be. The chamber was prepped, temperature calibrated, paperwork confirmed. The moment the door closed and the process began, something changed. The candle, which had stayed lit through transport, movement, even water, finally went out. No fanfare, just a clean extinguish. Flame gone. We stood there a few seconds longer than usual, both of us quiet. Not disturbed, not shaken, just thoughtful. Later that afternoon, I called Edward's sister to let her know everything had gone according to plan, and to arrange for the return of the few items she'd left. I hesitated, then decided to tell her about the candle. Not in a sensational way, just a careful retelling of what we saw. She didn't sound surprised. Her voice was steady, calm. He used to say that candle held everything he was afraid to say out loud, she told me. I think he needed it, until he didn't anymore. There's a line between the physical and emotional in this work, and sometimes it blurs. What matters isn't the explanation, it's the care we offer in those moments. The honoring of a life in ways that don't always make sense on paper. That candle sits in our office now, fully intact. No burn marks, no residue. Just a quiet reminder that sometimes the things we carry into death are the same ones that helped us survive life. And when they've done their job, they let go. Case came in on a Monday morning. Elderly male, 87. Name was Mr. Ellison. Died quietly at a long-term care facility. Natural causes, no trauma. Nothing out of the ordinary on paper. Transport crew brought him in before noon. I did the intake myself. He was small-framed, sunken in the face, the way people tend to get in the final weeks when they've stopped eating. Liver spots across his scalp. Light bruising around the arms, likely from IVs. No significant medical devices left in the body. Just a thin hospital gown, tagged at the wrist. I logged the time of arrival, tagged him properly, and moved him to refrigeration until prep. The next morning, I started work early. Embalming was scheduled for 7:30 a.m., open casket service planned for Friday. Family wanted a viewing, grandkids flying in from multiple states, so I planned to take my time with him. First thing I noticed, he had a slight grin on his face. That's not unusual. When people pass in their sleep, especially the elderly, the jaw sometimes settles in a relaxed way. I've seen worse. In fact, I've had cases where the face looked like it was caught mid-laugh. The human body doesn't die with cinematic elegance. There's gravity, slackness, muscles pulling in odd ways. I went ahead with the prep, arterial embalming, followed by cavity treatment. His body responded normally, no blockages, no purge, no unusual resistance. I cleaned him, closed the mouth using the standard needle injector, and set his features. I adjusted the jaw carefully, and placed eye caps to keep the lids shut. When I stepped back to look at his face, it seemed neutral, relaxed, exactly where I left it. I covered him, logged the procedure, and went on to my next case. Around noon, one of the interns came to me. Daniel, young kid, still learning the ropes. He looked a little unsure, said he'd gone to retrieve the Ellison case for cosmetic prep, and thought maybe the mouth had shifted. I assumed he'd just seen a bit of dehydration set in. Happens sometimes. The tissue contracts after embalming, especially if the room's too dry. I told him I'd take a look. When I pulled back the cloth, Mr. Ellison was still lying there, hands folded, face clean, but his mouth had a very slight curve to it. Not the slack kind you see with dehydration, and not the stiff kind you get with improper setting. It looked intentional, like a polite smile you give a stranger on the street. I checked my sutures. Everything was still in place. The muscle was set. There was no reason his face should have moved at all. Still, bodies change. Fluids shift. Temperature fluctuates. We know that. So I reset the mouth again, tightened the suture, even adjusted the cheeks slightly with cotton for support. When I left him that evening, his face was still and neutral. Next morning the smile was wider, not exaggerated like a cartoon, just enough to be clearly different than how I'd left it. It was in the corners of the mouth, mostly, the smallest upward pull. I stared at him longer than I'd care to admit, not because I was scared, because I was trying to understand. I rechecked everything, sutures intact, no slippage, cotton still in place. I didn't tell anyone. There's a quiet pride in this work. You don't want to seem like you can't manage your case. So I reset his expression a third time, and I decided to leave a time-stamped note next to him, just a folded card, with the exact time and position of his mouth logged in my handwriting. Thursday morning, the card was untouched. The body hadn't been moved, but the smile was back, a little higher this time, teeth slightly exposed. That's when I asked for the security footage. We don't often review it unless something goes missing or a delivery's late. But the prep room has a camera, wide angle, low resolution, nothing fancy. The director let me scrub through the night's footage, and I watched the whole 12-hour loop on fast forward. Nothing happened for hours, still frame after still frame. But then just past 3 a.m., the footage caught something. It was subtle, barely visible. The corners of his mouth, pulling upward. Just a fraction. No other part of the body moved. Just the mouth. Over the course of about 6 minutes, frame by frame, the smile returned. No one entered the room. No temperature spike. No tampering. Just those tiny muscle movements, slow, almost reluctant, until his face returned to that same calm grin. I showed the footage to the director. He didn't say much, just leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. "You want me to notify the family?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, they don't need to know. I'll manage it." And I did. That afternoon I performed facial reconstruction, not out of necessity, but out of persistence. I removed the suture, reset the mouth, using stronger positioning, reinforced the tissue with internal filler. I used wax to correct the edges, and applied a neutral expression. By the time I was done, he looked at peace. The next day was the viewing. His daughter thanked me, said he looked more like himself than she remembered. She even smiled, and told me, Dad was always grinning, never took anything too seriously. She said it like it was a fond memory. I stood quietly in the back, during the service, watched as guests walked by the casket. No one saw anything strange. No one said a word about the expression. If anything, the smile seemed to comfort them. After the burial, I logged the case as closed. Final disposition, completed. But I kept a copy of the footage. I don't know why. Maybe to remind myself that we don't always have the final say, no matter how precise we try to be. People think embalming is about control, about preservation, manipulation of the physical form. But sometimes, the body holds on to something else. Memory, habit, identity. Or maybe just a final message we were never meant to fully understand. Whatever it was, Mr. Ellison took it with him. And I hope, wherever he is, he's still smiling. Thank you all for joining me on these journeys. Your support means everything, and I love reading your reactions and personal experiences in the comments. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat or gave you chills, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more haunting stories. Have you ever experienced something similar? Or perhaps you have your own unexplainable story to share? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, don't forget to share this video with them. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories, and remember, sometimes the scariest tales are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, if you dare.